Oh yeah. duplicating services?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Scott. I think this, again, could be one of the most transformative things we do in the 21st century regarding ubiquitous broadband, to allow everyone from wherever they may live in the United States to participate in the modern data-driven economy. We are, again, working with FCC. We're working with the Department of Commerce in the Rural Prosperity Task Force. We made it a good one of the primary points. The good news is the administration
The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. And pursuant to Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11, the chair may postpone further proceedings on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered. The gentleman is recognized, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I thank the Chair. Mr. Chairman, our committee has a constitutional duty to conduct rigorous oversight of the executive branch. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side of the aisle have forsaken that duty. At our last markup in November, we were blocked on our request to vote on 6 motions to subpoena documents relating to critical issues that are legitimate issues before this committee. Since then, we've asked for an additional 13 subpoenas. We described each and every one of those requests in separate letters. We summarized them again in a letter to the Chairman just last week. We understand the Chairman personally may disagree with our requests, but our committee members deserve an opportunity to debate and vote on these motions, as we most certainly did during the Obama years. It is true that House rules provide that the Chairman can issue subpoenas unilaterally, but those same rules also provide that we as a body may vote to approve them. That's all we're asking for today. Some of these requests started out as bipartisan. For example, last year, the committee sent a bipartisan request to the Trump Organization. Since the President refused to divest his assets or set up a blind trust, it was important, we felt, for this committee to know, well, how would that organization collect and report foreign government payments? But the Trump Organization refused to produce those documents. They refused to provide specific sources of foreign government payments and the amounts of those payments. They completely rejected our bipartisan request for those documents. Now, it used to be that if somebody defied this committee, we would issue a subpoena. But that's not what happened here. In fact, the opposite has happened. The committee dropped it. My friends on the other side of the aisle said, you don't want to give us those documents? Okay, it's fine with us. So last month, every Democratic member of this committee signed a letter to the Chairman asking him to either issue a subpoena or allow us to vote on one. Having heard nothing, we've been forced to request today's motions and subpoenas. Our list of subpoena motions also includes government-wide issues that are central to our jurisdiction as a committee, like our request for copies of each agency's plans to downsize its workforce. Our subpoena requests are for a wide variety of agencies, including the White House, OMB, DHS, HHS, DOJ, FDIC, and outside entities on a wide variety of issues within our core jurisdiction. For all of those reasons, I hereby move this committee authorize and issue subpoenas for documents on 13 topics as described in my letter with Ranking Member Cummings to the Chairman last week. The motion is at the clerk's desk.
The gentleman from Virginia was recognized for the purpose of offering an opening statement, and therefore the motion that he mentions in his opening statement is not in order.
Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
A follow-up question to your ruling. Can the members of the committee expect a date certain whereby the issue of these pending subpoena requests will be addressed?
Well, the gentleman's not stating a parliamentary inquiry, so what parliamentary inquiry would the gentleman be stating?
When parliamentary inquiry, when would it be in order, Mr. Chairman, for the committee to consider pending outstanding requests for subpoenas?
The only time that any motion for a subpoena would be in order is if it were actually included in the agenda, on the agenda, and as the gentleman from Virginia knows, that subpoena requests are not on today's agenda.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the Chairman for his response. I do wish to put my good friend from North Carolina and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on notice. This is not an issue that will go away, and on our side of the aisle, we will persist, and sooner or later, we will prevail.
I thank the gentleman, and I say that in the truest sense of the word, gentleman, for his tenacious but yet kind way that he passionately puts forth his message, his admonishment and direction is certainly noted. And with that, our first item for consideration is H.R. 4887, the Grant Reporting Efficiency and Agreements Transparency Act, or the GREAT Act of 2018. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4887, to modernize federal grant reporting and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for the amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It is my understanding that the gentlewoman from North Carolina and sponsor of the bill, Dr. Fox, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentlewoman is recognized to call up her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do ask for consideration of the bill in the nature of an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4887, offered by Ms. Fox of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and her amendment. Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you very much for taking up the Grant Reporting Efficiency and Agreements Transparency Act, or the GREAT Act of 2018, and I give the staff all the credit for coming up with that title. Every year, the U.S. government awards more than $600 billion to state and local governments, agencies, and a wide variety of other organizations. Congress uses grants and cooperative agreements to transfer funds to carry out a public purpose authorized by law. Now, we all know that Congress can have a severe disagreements on what actually constitutes purposes that warrant taxpayer funds. We debate that topic every day on Capitol Hill. However, the GREAT Act was based on a set of shared principles that I believe are universally accepted. Congress should ensure that grant funding is being utilized efficiently, and at the very least that our policies aren't acting as an impediment to maximizing efficiency. 2, American taxpayers deserve to know where their taxpayer dollars are going. 3, reducing compliance costs and demanding better data are not mutually exclusive principles. We can do both by leveraging 21st century technology. Those set of principles brought Representative Gomez and me together to work on this issue, and the GREAT Act is the byproduct. The GREAT Act will streamline federal grant reporting by replacing outdated documents with open data, increase transparency from grant-making agencies, and reduce compliance costs. It will do so by tasking OMB and a standard-setting agency with creating standardized data elements needed for guidance to agencies awarding grants within 1 year. While OMB sets forth on this project, we mandate that it interface and consult with industry stakeholders, members of the public, and grant recipients. As a former educator and college president, I know firsthand the difficulties federal grant applicants face when it comes to compliance with grant reporting. The task is cumbersome, laborious, and laden with inefficiency. It's important to understand that these data standards are the means to a greater end. Standards don't do much by themselves, but the public should keep in mind that when data standards are built, the software will come. The eventual software written is what will ultimately transform the grant reporting process by reducing costs and yielding better utilization of grant reporting data. These standards will also enable our agencies to better collect, maintain, and analyze the data that's already subject to be reported pursuant to our nation's grant and cooperative agreement contracts. This electronic searchable data can provide instant insights to our agencies as well as Congress when we conduct oversight. I'd also like to make mention of certain privacy protections in the bill. First, privacy experts and privacy advocates are included in the consultations section. We want their input into how these standards get developed. In addition, we ensure there'll be no disclosure to the public of information that would be exempt from disclosure under Freedom of Information Act. That's explicit in our bill. Lastly, the rule of construction makes clear that we are not requiring the collection of any new data in the grant reporting process, period. We're simply interested in transforming the means of the data submission, that of electronic data that comports with modern-day technology. While we're ultimately undertaking this project to serve taxpayers better, I should also mention that we have the input and backing from a large swath of the grant recipient community. The National Grants Management Association, the Association of Government Accountants have all voiced support for the bill. The American Library Association and the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition are also giving us support, and many other trade associations, organizations, and nonprofits have been consulted. I'm confident that the committee can get our nation's grant reporting structure into the 21st century by passing this bill, and I believe the changes we're making will yield demonstrative results in spending efficiencies and gains in public transparency. Let's do what's right for the taxpayers, grant recipients, and our own constitutional mandates of oversight and stewardship by passing the GREAT Act. I'd like to thank Mr. Gomez for his work on this bipartisan achievement. He's proven to be a great partner, and I'm glad to have him on this committee. I'd also like to thank Mr. Issa, not just for his original co-sponsorship, but for his authorship of the original Data Act. The Data Act gave us the pilot program that this endeavor was based upon. I'd like to thank Director Mulvaney and his staff for their attention. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, for your expedient consideration and for the attention of the staff. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina for her leadership. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. To speak on behalf of this bill.
Does the gentleman have an amendment at the desk? The clerk will designate the amendment. Okay, hold on. So if
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4887 offered by Mr. Gomez of California.
Okay, without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Reserving a point of order, the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. My amendment is meant to apply the standards established in the GREAT Act to government contractors. I understand that in the Data Act, the committee worked to modernize both grant and contracting reporting. I share the desire to apply the standards established in the GREAT Act to government contractors, and I will offer a standalone bill, once again with Representative Fox, so that we can properly address the contracting process. Given the magnitude of the federal contracts, I would like to take the time to conduct the due diligence necessary to make the GREAT Act even greater. It has been a pleasure to work across the aisle on this issue, and I look forward to working with Representative Fox and committee staff from both sides so that we can advance both contracting and grants bills to the House floor in the coming months. With that, I yield back to the chair.
So does the gentleman withdraw his amendment?
Yes, I do.
The amendment is, without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Does any other member wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Conley, for what
Chair-
purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4887, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Without objection, the amendment is considered read. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment, and first of all, I want to thank Ms. Fox and Mr. Gomez for a very thoughtful bill, which I certainly in spirit support. But this amendment would strike the language in the bill that encourages the use of non-proprietary identifiers to track federal grants and replace them with a more detailed requirement. Under my amendment, the Director of OMB and the Secretary of HHS would be required to evaluate whether to use non-proprietary identifiers in the data standards they establish under this bill. For decades, the Federal Government has used proprietary identifiers and data standards for recipients of Federal funds, such as grantees and Federal contractors. Any action taken to switch to non-proprietary identifiers should be done only after careful consideration. It may be a good idea, but we need to know that. My amendment would require OMB and HHS to consider factors such as accessibility and cost to recipients of Federal awards, agencies that issue Federal awards, private sector experts, and members of the public, including privacy experts and advocates. The issue of whether to use non-proprietary identifiers is one that should be looked at and addressed holistically rather than done piecemeal or on an ad hoc basis. As I say, without prejudice to the merits of the idea. GSA surveyed the industry on this issue back in 2012 and issued 2 reports for information over the past year to obtain feedback on entity identification services for the government. We must be careful not to govern by fiat and instead evaluate the most prudent course of action before forcing the executive branch to take an action that could, without intending to, cost taxpayers more money in the long run. So we await the study and the evaluation. This is a complex issue that deserves careful consideration and input from stakeholders. My amendment would simply require this issue be studied carefully first and action taken pursuant to those findings subsequently. I urge the committee, as a matter of prudence, to adopt this amendment. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his amendment. Does any other member wish to be heard? The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very tempted to force a debate on this issue because it's one that I feel very strongly about. However, out of the spirit of bipartisanship we've experienced thus far on this bill, I'm not going to do that. However, I will say it's passing strange that members who publicly profess to want transparency and restoration of Article I authority are willing to allow a monopolistic operation to continue. That being said, the debate over a non-proprietary standard for identifiers is central to that of any debate on government data and transparency in our government's procurement process. To speak plainly, the current framework that relies on a proprietary identifier to track our government's processes enshrines an effective monopoly. That is not my characterization, that's the characterization of the GSA. Because the government uses this proprietary identifier, any user of grant and contract information must purchase a license in order to download and use that data Dun & Bradstreet owns, the DUNS number, and charges royalties for its use. While a rule was finalized to stop the legal requirement of this proprietary product, the government-wide contract stemming from this relationship is still binding. If you're outside the government, you must purchase a license to any data that includes the DUNS number and go through Dun & Bradstreet if you want full access to public data, data that shows the expenditures of taxpayers' money. According to GAO, proprietary restrictions on GSO's use of the DUNS number limits, quote, how and where Dun & Bradstreet data can be used. This is taxpayer data and data that stems from public spending. Yet we continue to rely upon a framework that enriches one sole contractor in exchange for obtaining it. The lack of competition has led to rising costs, according to GSA. Anticipated benefits of replacing the DUNS number include long-term savings, unlimited data rights, and greater transparency, according to GAO. That sounds a lot like what we're trying to accomplish under the underlying GREAT Act. If the government switched to a non-proprietary identifier for grantees, data about federal grant spending would become freely available to taxpayers and analytics companies. I understand that some of my colleagues believe that we should simply remain silent on this issue, that we should let the current contract before we should act and let the executive branch decide this. I think that's wrong. It ignores the fact that this is an Article I issue. After all, the programs that necessitate the use of a DUNS number are created by Congress. These contracts are used to acquire services for the direct benefit of an agency to fulfill a duty of government, or in the case of grants, achieve what Congress has identified as a public good, and Congress is responsible for funding those duties and grants. Is it not the duty of Congress to ensure that we're controlling costs in our procurement processes? Is it not the duty of Congress to ensure that those outside the government can analyze data and provide needed accountability with having to go through a gatekeeper of the public's information? This issue is not going away. It'll continue to be debated in every matter related to efficiency in government, transparency in government spending, and the central question of who owns government data. I believe we should be tearing down barriers to taxpayer-funded data, not perpetuating monopolies. I believe we should be utilizing systems and 21st century frameworks that create efficiencies, not limit them. I believe we should be fostering more transparency in the performance of government grants, not hiding performance levels behind paywalls. I urge my colleagues to vote in accordance with their publicly stated principles. And I want to make one other comment, Mr. Chairman, and that is I want to thank Mr. Gomez for his comments on his amendment related to adding contracting to the original bill, and I publicly state I will work with him and co-sponsor a bill of his related to the contracting issue. I yield back.
Does any other member wish to be heard? The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly applaud Dr. Fox for her unwavering and untiring work to try to make government more efficient. I think the underlying bill certainly gets at a lot of the need when it comes to grant abuses, and this is something that we have discussed in the past and that we need to get to. I am a bit concerned with a couple of aspects as we move forward, and you make an excellent, or Dr. Fox makes an excellent point, Mr. Chairman, about the government-owned data and who truly has access to it and who owns it. But I think there's a couple of things worth bearing in mind as we approach this. In the past 5 years, 1.3 million new entities were registered into the existing system. And looking forward, if a non-proprietary ID system was required by law, each entity would need to re-register into a new system that would cost time and money. So it's not necessarily freely available under a new system. A non-proprietary identifier option has varying costs that grantees could have to pay, anywhere from $75 to $128 for each new registration, and it doesn't end there. These costs could continue to increase upon the user from $50 to $91 per year in annual renewals. That, in sum, means that whoever this new entity providing the services would be raking in $50 million plus in fees, which are currently not garnished. And this would essentially create an unfunded mandate on grant awardees. And so that's where I think some of the concern comes from. The language also could necessarily limit government in which solutions they can pursue to meet future needs if non-proprietary identifier language were to go forward. And the process by which the contract has been awarded has been reviewed several times, including having contract recompete competitions. And a full and robust process should be supported to ensure taxpayers receive the best solutions. I think we're all in agreement of that. But legally prohibiting an entity from competing due to the type of solution they provide is anti-competitive and could be viewed as the government picking winners rather than losers, which I don't think is the intent, knowing the members of this committee, of any member. I think we all want what is best, not only for the user, but for the efficiency of government. And so that's why, Mr. Chairman, I think Mr. Connolly's amendment makes sense. I will support it. I think there are some factors here, as I've laid out, and others, and Dr. Fox certainly makes some good points. And as was stated earlier, it is probably worthy of a full debate on that, and we've not really had that. So because of that, I will be supporting the Connolly amendment.
Would my friend yield?
I would be happy to.
I want to thank him. I think he said it as well as can be stated. This is not about somebody wants transparency, somebody doesn't. This is about methodically making sure that there aren't unintended consequences. We have a system in place. If we're going to change it, it has to be fact-based. That analysis has to be before us. And we do have studies that are ongoing that hopefully will help provide that guidance. If and when that guidance is provided and we're persuaded of the merits of changing, I'll gladly join with Ms. Fox in voting for that. But that evidence is not in front of us, and as my friend from Oklahoma has very ably identified, this could have unintended consequences just doing it by fiat in terms of costs to the system, to grantees, and to federal agencies we don't need to incur. And so I thank the gentleman for his thoughtful intervention, and I yield back to Mr.
Chairman,
Wilson.
I'm reclaiming my time. I would like to give the remainder to Dr. Fox for any comments she may have as well.
Well, I'd just like to ask the gentleman from Oklahoma a question. I heard you say, I think, that the potential benefit to the proprietary entity is $50 million. Is that the number that I heard you say?
It could be estimated, and really it would, an accurate number, Dr. Fox, would be an extrapolation of the $50 to $91 annual renewals plus the re-registration of every entity at $75 to $128. Thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts who the chair reluctantly overlooked just a few minutes ago. So my sincere apology with a recognition for 5 minutes.
No offense taken, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for recognizing me. I do want to compliment Dr. Fox and Mr. Gomez for your bipartisan work together, and I appreciate and associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman from Oklahoma in support of Mr. Connolly's amendment. The breadth and the scope of the government use of private contractors puts a lot of pressure on the security clearance process. And for more than 6 months, the White House has been withholding from our committee documents relating to its protocol for suspending security clearances while it investigates allegations of a national security risk. On June 21st, 2017, the Democratic members of our committee wrote to the White House requesting information about the White House's failure to suspend the security clearances for former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and current Senior Advisor to the President Jared Kushner, who, by the way, has set up a private server to conduct official business, which sounds painfully familiar. In both of these instances, the question is the same. Why did the White House disregard the strict rules governing the suspension of security clearances? The rules around suspending security clearances were intended to halt the flow of classified information to an individual who could be a national security risk until the allegations are fully investigated and resolved. Those rules apply throughout the government to the federal workforce. but it is apparent that the White House has a different standard for its own employees. And as the Committee of Jurisdiction, we have a significant obligation to investigate and to provide oversight and reform recommendations. In the case of Mr. Kushner, he submitted a national security clearance application listing no foreign contacts. Later, reportedly, he supplemented this section 3 separate times and has now added more than 100 names of foreign contacts. In October 2017, the Director of the National Background Investigation Bureau testified that Mr. Kushner's errors and omissions were unprecedented. And for these reasons, on January 18, 2018, Ranking Member Cummings and members of this committee requested that Chairman Gowdy issue a subpoena or permit a full committee to vote on a subpoena to compel the White House to produce its policy in suspending security clearances, as well as the specific considerations that govern the case of Mr. Kushner and General Flynn. Chairman Gowdy refused to issue those subpoenas and refused to put this on the agenda for today's hearing. So, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, this is information that is critical to our oversight function. This security clearance procedure is incredibly important. It's something that you and I and members of this committee have worked on in the past in protection of our Federal employees, co-contractors, our military, and civilian personnel. And it's a matter that I think you agree is in our committee's direct jurisdiction, in which GAO just elevated to its high-risk list. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm just asking a courtesy that you might consider scheduling a vote on a subpoena to get the necessary information about what the White House is doing with security clearances. I think it's right in our wheelhouse. It has to do with all of the contracting that we're talking about here today. It affects every single contract, and it just mystifies me that we had, I think, 9 hearings because Secretary Clinton has set up a home server and conducted official business, and now we don't care so much because this was Jared Kushner who set up a private server and is doing it. It's sort of like the deficit. We used to be really concerned about the deficit until the Trump tax reform added $1.5 trillion to the deficit. We don't care about that anymore. So, but security clearance is very, very important. I know we all take that very seriously. I know that my Republican colleagues are as equally interested in making sure we get that system right. And that's what we're looking to do here. I'm not trying to make political hay, but I'm using it as an example so that we can get to the heart of the matter, which is to have a security clearance process that has integrity, that is reliable, and that is equally applied to all Federal employees. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his kind remarks and his tenacious spirit. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mitchell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I assure you I won't take 5 minutes, and I will talk about the GREAT Act. I support the bill, but I also support Mr. Connolly's amendment. And the reason I do so is we've been talking about this proprietary information, these Dun & Bradstreet numbers, is in a vacuum. As you know, I led fair-sized businesses for 35 years. In that process, we registered for a D&B number for almost every transaction we conducted. Credit, a whole series of things. D&B, for better or for worse, has become part of the system. So all contractors and most agencies have to register for those for other purposes beside this type of thing. In fact, doing a non-proprietary system would, in fact, create a duplicate system, because I doubt the rest of the world out there will simply eliminate it and say we'll go to some other system. So I think Mr. Russell's fear is even worse, in that we'll have that cost, and we'll have another system created which has another set of costs and more confusion. So I support Mr. Connolly's amendment. I think it's the right thing to do at this point in time, and would urge its approval. Thank you very much, sir.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan. Does any other member wish to be heard? The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to speak on the underlying bill and the aims. Yes, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to begin by thanking Congresswoman Fox for her leadership on this important piece of legislation and working closely with me. I also want to thank the staff who spent countless hours over the past months negotiating and drafting this legislation. I know it might seem as a surprise that two members from opposite sides of the political spectrum, as well as opposite sides of the room, to come together to work on a piece of legislation. But with some common sense from both sides of the aisle, we can come together to solve problems facing working families across the country. And hopefully, we can also work on some other issues that are important to the American people. The GREAT Act is a straightforward bill that seeks to modernize the grant reporting process by standardizing the information reported by grant recipients. By creating greater efficiencies in the grant reporting process, the GREAT Act will create a more open and transparent grant process for all recipients. In Los Angeles, this means greater opportunities for organizations working to make government work for Angelenos. Universities, city departments, and other organizations will be able to automate their reporting costs, reduce compliance costs, and focus all their energy on utilizing the $57.9 million in federal grants to make Los Angeles a more prosperous city. By making grant reports machine-readable and fully searchable, the GREAT Act will improve the performance of the grant process and break down barriers to grants. Nonprofits and other community organizations will have better access to federal grants so they can leverage federal dollars to maximize their local impact. It is my hope that the GREAT Act will be a small but significant step towards ensuring that government works as efficiently as possible for the American people. And I look forward to working with Representative Fox and others to continue our bipartisan effort to make government work even better. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
We know that the Russian government-backed hackers attempted to infiltrate the state election systems on 2016. Congress has an obligation to help states develop technologies and protocols to prevent election interference. However, we cannot do that if the Trump administration continues to actively conceal critical documents directly related to the security of our elections and voting system. In May 17, 2017, in mid-September 2017, numerous press outlets reported that the Department of Homeland Security notified 21 states, including my home state of Illinois, that they were identified as targets of Russian government-linked hacking attempts into their election systems. On October 20, 2017, Ranking Member Cummings and I sent a letter to DHS requesting documents relating to these Russian-backed efforts to monitor, penetrate, or otherwise hack at least 21 state election systems in the 2016 election. We requested those documents by October 31, 2017. After more than 5 weeks, DHS produced just one email with a 13-sentence script that department employees apparently read over the phone to the state election officials with no information referring to any specific state or attack. On November 29, 2017, during a joint subcommittee hearing on the cybersecurity of voting machines, I introduced our October 20th letter into the official hearing record and questioned DHS official Christopher Krebs on when documents would be provided in response to that letter. Chairman Hurd echoed my request for more information on these hack attempts, and Mr. Krebs assured me that a response would be forthcoming. Mr. Krebs expressed concern that providing the requested information would violate a confidential relationship with states while failing to acknowledge that our letter requested information DHS had collected from other sources and not the states themselves. On January 3, 2018, the subcommittee sent Mr. Krebs' official request for the record that included a request from myself and Ranking Member Demings to produce documents related to these attempts to hack state election systems, as well as details regarding the manner and substance of DHS notifications and follow-ups to affected states. To date, despite multiple requests and Mr. Krebs' assurances at our hearing, DHS has provided no further information. Mr. Chairman, we need this information to do our job, and asking DHS nicely and even official committee questions for the record have not worked. Mr. Chairman, this is why we need to subpoena these documents from DHS. but you have blocked us today from taking a vote on subpoena. Mr. Chairman, when will you schedule a vote on this subpoena so that we can obtain these documents from DHS? I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman for her kind comments. Is any other member wish to seek recognition? The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes. New Jersey, I'm sorry. I was looking beyond Michigan right to New Jersey. All right, the gentlewoman from New Jersey, my apology.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, on September 18, 2017, the New York Times reported that, and I quote, Trump administration officials under pressure from the White House to provide a rationale for reducing the number of refugees allowed into the United States next year rejected a study by the Department of Health and Human Services that found that refugees brought in $63 billion more in government revenues over the past decade than they cost. The Times story specifically named White House advisor Stephen Miller as having participated in modifying this report to cherry-pick data that would justify his argument that the government should sharply reduce refugee admission numbers. Let me repeat that. The allegation is that the White House staff removed the facts from the HHS report that showed that refugees are a massive net economic benefit to our economy, because that apparently did not fit in with the White House narrative. Clearly, this issue needs investigation. So on September 26, 2017, ranking members from this committee and the House Judiciary Committee sent letters to the White House and to HHS requesting drafts of this report and all the communications about the edits to the report. The White House ignored the letter entirely and provided us with no response. HHS responded 2 months later with a cursory letter that refused to provide any of the requested documents. Meanwhile, the Trump administration announced that it was decreasing the refugee admissions cap to 45,000 for the coming year, the lowest level in decades. On January 12, 2018, ranking members Cummings and Lynch wrote to Chairman Gowdy seeking subpoenas for the documents that the White House and HHS have now withheld for more than 4 months. Federal policy must be based on the best available evidence and fact, and it is unacceptable if the White House is interfering with agency work by doctoring reports and removing relevant information. Our committee has subpoena power, and we need to use it to get the facts here. So, Mr. Chairman, what do Democrats on our committee need to do to get you, Mr. Gowdy in particular, to permit us to schedule a vote on this important issue? And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. The gentlewoman from Michigan is seeking recognition.
The real.
And she's recognized for 5 minutes.
That's right, from Michigan.
Not New Jersey.
Not New Jersey. Mr. Chairman, I want to speak to the need for a subpoena so that this committee can obtain a full and unredacted copy of the DHS Inspector General's report about the implementation of the President's first Muslim ban. This is a fundamental matter of government transparency. This is a basic work of our committee. We have no support from our Republican counterparts in getting this document, and the Department of Homeland Security refuses to let us see a copy. After we received complaints that Custom and Border Patrol agents were taking coercive actions to implement the President's Executive Order 38, members of Congress asked the Inspector General to launch an investigation. When the Inspector General completed his report, DHS officials tried to block him from issuing it. On November 20th, 2017, Inspector General Roth took the highly unusual step of sending Congress a letter stating that his office had completed a report on this investigation and warned that the department was seeking to censure many portions of the report by using unprecedented claims of attorney-client privilege, deliberate process privilege. He stated, "We regularly have published dozens of reports that divulge into the department's rationale for specific policies and decisions and comment on the basis and process on which these decisions were made. Indeed, that is at the heart of what the Inspector Generals do." I agree. That is exactly what Inspector Generals do. And my Democratic colleagues also agree. On January 17, 2018, all Democratic members of this committee wrote to the chairman seeking a subpoena for the unredacted report and a full case file. The next day, DHS finally permitted the IG to release a version of the report, but redacted a great deal of information without even explaining why, as required by the Freedom of Information Act. These redactions were unjustifiable. They included removing communications with third parties, which are not covered by the privilege DHS claim. Furthermore, chairmen of this committee from both parties have long demanded that we obtain unredacted reports. We need to compel this full report and documents from DHS. We cannot permit DHS to cover up and hide the Inspector General's finding. We deserve to know, and the public deserves to know, exactly how DHS implemented the President's travel ban and how DHS made the decisions that impacted so many lives. Mr. Chairman, I understand you have blocked our vote on this issue today. What can we do to get you to schedule a vote to obtain these documents for the future? Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. It's my understanding that the gentlewoman from North Carolina has a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to enter into the record a letter from members of this committee asking the chairman and ranking member to ask for the report from OMB related to the discussion we had on Mr. Connolly's amendment. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection, so ordered. They have called votes. The chair is going to recognize the gentleman from Maryland for 5 minutes, and then we will go in recess subject to the call of the chair after that.
Mr. Chair, parliamentary inquiry?
Yes, the gentleman will state his inquiry.
I just want clarification. We are still on the GREAT Act, correct? We're supposed to be dealing with that, because I'm a little confused at this point. So I just want clarity from the chair.
The gentleman is correct.
Okay, I wasn't sure because it seems like we've wandered a bit, and maybe we could actually talk about that.
Mr. Chairman, to be even more precise, Ms. Mitchell, we're on the Connolly Amendment to the GREAT Act.
And regulatory efficiency in the federal government. And I want to refer specifically to this committee's direct jurisdiction over the Presidential Records Act, which was first adopted in 1978. And, Mr. Chairman, you know that the Presidential Records Act requires that any White House employee who conducts government business on a private email must turn over a complete copy of that email correspondence to the employee's White House email account within a 20-day period. And this is a principle that this committee has guarded zealously. Many members here, including our esteemed chairman, Mr. Gowdy, when he was chairing the Select Committee on Benghazi, have stated for many years that the use of private email for the purposes of conducting government business is a serious problem and a serious offense, and that this committee's investigation of improper email usage is a legitimate and necessary use of our resources. Now, I raise this, Mr. Chairman, because the minority has requested that we ask for a subpoena with respect to Mr. Kushner's admitted use of private email to conduct government business. Mr. Kushner's attorney has admitted publicly that Kushner used his private email account to conduct official White House business, but he has not said that his client has complied with the statutory 20-day requirement. And so what we're asking for, Mr. Chairman, is simply this committee stand up for the principle it has championed for a long time and insist with a subpoena that Mr. Kushner turn over all of the emails that were conducted on a private account, on a private server, in the pursuit of White House business. So we asked in December, Ranking Member Cummings wrote to Mr. Gowdy asking for a subpoena of Mr. Kushner for the emails he sent. We've not received any response from the majority, which is baffling to us because we know this is a principle that both sides of the aisle hold dear. And I'm just asking whether we could commit in the future to scheduling a markup, Mr. Chairman, where the full committee can debate this problem of the private use of private email servers by Mr. Kushner and others, and then vote on a subpoena to get those emails so we can get to the bottom of this problem. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Knowing that we still have enough time to make it to the vote, is there any other member wishing to be heard? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Conley. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 4887 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amendment, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The committee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair. The committee will come to order. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 4917, the IG Subpoena Authority Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4917 to amend the Inspector General Act of 1978 to provide testimonial subpoena authority and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma and the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Russell, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the course of conducting audits and investigations, IGs have found that federal employees sometimes resign before the IG is able to interview the employee. This severely hampers an IG from conducting and completing audits and investigations to identify waste, fraud, and abuse. In fact, the IG community has informed us of dozens of cases that went cold when witnesses refused to testify voluntarily. This bill seeks in a bipartisan fashion to address these gaps in evidence by permitting IGs to subpoena the attendance and testimony of witnesses during the course of an audit or investigation. It also follows upon several hearings where we have addressed this issue. While this is a necessary authority for IGs to possess, it's important to ensure that the authority is not abused in any way. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle may point out such concerns when this issue was contested by this committee in 2010, citing witch hunt concerns. Unlike then, the following three-tiered safeguards are contained in the bill. First, the subpoena power does not apply to federal employees, as there are many other things that already apply to them, and that is consistent with other agencies that have this authority, like the Department of Defense. To prevent abuse, the IG must get approval from a panel of 3 other IGs from the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. The panel of fellow IGs must approve or deny the subpoena request within 10 days of the request being filed. Further, if a subpoena request is approved by the panel of IGs, the requesting IG is still not done. They must also notify the Attorney General of the pending subpoena. The Attorney General is then able to review the subpoena and may object to its issuance if it will interfere with any other ongoing investigation. Once these steps have been completed, an IG may then issue the subpoena. This addresses the safeguards, and it deals with those that prior in their capacity may be dealing with whistleblowers, and they've been identified as the problem, or you see in issues of waste, fraud, and abuse, and then they suddenly retire, or they depart, or they leave, and then they ignore the request of the IGs for interview or for any other investigation. This rightfully will allow the Department of the Inspector General with authority that is not unlike what we see in our Department of Defense. The committee held a hearing, Mr. Chairman, in November 2017, highlighting many of the issues that IGs face when conducting their oversight. And during that hearing, Mrs. Kathy Buller, the Peace Corps Inspector General and Chair of the Legislation Committee at the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, spoke about the many legislative priorities for the IG community. And I would like to submit, for the record, a letter from Ms. Buller outlining these priorities dated 26 May 2017.
Without objection, so ordered.
Testimonial subpoena authority has been a top priority for Inspectors General for a long time. It does apply to non-federal employees, not those that are currently in the system. Last Congress, this committee and the House passed a version of the Inspector General Empowerment Act that contained a provision very similar to this bill, and it had bipartisan support. Unfortunately, we were unable to get these provisions through our colleagues in the Senate, and testimonial subpoena authority was not included in the bill that became law, to the detriment of good oversight and reform. Again, this is a vital tool that IGs can use to conduct and complete thorough audits and investigations. IGs are an essential partner for Congress and, by extension, to we the people that empower government. In fiscal year 2016 alone, the IG Community's work resulted in potential savings totaling approximately $45 billion. We must provide inspectors general with the tools they need to fully accomplish their mission. Testimonial subpoena authority is one such tool, and a critical one at that. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our friend from Oklahoma for a thoughtful bill I certainly intend to support. I know he's put a lot of care into this, and for the record, Mr. Cartwright had a conflicting commitment at this time, but he wanted me to point out a lot of the protections Mr. Russell has in the bill that would, I think, ameliorate a lot of concerns that have raised in the past. I would simply ask my friend that if he would be committed to working with us to explore further limiting the bill to allow subpoenas of only allow subpoenas of former federal employees and recipients of federal funds. In 2010, the Washington Post editorial board advocated that testimonial subpoena authority for inspectors general be tailored in this way, and I would simply ask if my friend would try to work with us to see if we can address that concern as we try to move forward.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Virginia.
I yield.
And as you can see from the three-tiered safeguards in there, many of the 2010 concerns are addressed in that fashion, and I look forward to continuing to work together.
I thank my friend, and again, I thank him for his thoughtful contribution, and I yield back.
Does any other member wish to be heard? The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 4917 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 3076, creating Advanced Streamlined Electronic Services, or the Cases Act for Constituent Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3076 to amend Section 552A of Title V United States Code, commonly referred to as the Privacy Act, to require agencies to accept electronic release forms and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill can be considered as read and open for amendment at any point without objection. So ordered. I will now turn to the amendment in the nature of a substitute that I have at the desk. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3076, offered by Mr. Meadows of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment. H.R. 3076, as amended, helps Americans obtain assistance from federal agencies by allowing them to submit Privacy Act waivers electronically. Key function of a congressional office is helping constituents navigate the complicated federal bureaucracies, whether it is a senior who needs help with Social Security benefits or a veteran whose benefits have been delayed. All members do casework. And to help their constituents navigate the federal bureaucracy, this particular bill would actually allow for those privacy release forms that many of us are very familiar with to be done so electronically. I can tell you that in my particular office, this is an issue that constantly slows up the process. This particular act would allow those to actually be done electronically. It would save those that perhaps have physical impairments from having to come to a congressional office. And so the process that we currently have, I believe, is outdated, and this bill goes to speed up the process and allow for constituents to submit Privacy Act consent forms electronically. The bill also requires the Office of OMB to issue guidance to federal agencies to accept the electronic consent. OMB's guidance will maintain a role for members to advocate on behalf of their constituents for swift resolution of the cases. This is a bipartisan bill that will help Americans communicate with their government at times where there is a need to do so, and obviously, if that need is urgent, they can do it very quickly. So I would urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York for any statement on the bill. Ms. Maloney for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding and for his support, and I likewise support this bill, the Cases for Constituents Act, introduced by Representative Garrett Graves and Joe Kennedy. This bill would modernize the way federal agencies process Privacy Act waivers, and it would make it easier for members of Congress to help constituents get assistance from federal agencies. A constituent has to provide an agency with written consent before a congressional office can obtain information from the agency on behalf of the constituent. Some agencies have outdated policies that will require these consent forms to be mailed or faxed. Under this bill, federal agencies would be required to accept consent forms and any necessary supporting documents electronically. The bill would require the Office of Manage and Budget to operate a consolidated online portal that would allow individuals to submit electronic consent forms and to track the status of their form. The bill would also allow congressional offices to provide online links to the portal. I appreciate the majority's cooperation on the substitute amendment we are considering, which includes a number of improvements. For example, the substitute amendment would require OMB to include features to protect the privacy of individuals who use the consolidated online portal required under the bill. This is a good bipartisan bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. Does any other member wish to be heard? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 3076 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Our next item for consideration is actually H.R. 4631, the Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4631, to require the Director of the Government Publishing Office to establish and maintain a website accessible to the public that allows the public to obtain electronic copies of all congressionally mandated reports in one place and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill is sponsored by Representative Quigley and has bipartisan support, which is the subject of today's a lot of bipartisan bills today. Federal agencies are required to produce numerous reports every year. Many of the reports provided that is integral to Congress's actions that citizens and other agencies will want to see. However, it's very difficult to track down older reports, and there's no single repository where the public can go to see these reports themselves. H.R. 4631 will solve that problem. The bill directs the Government Publishing Office to bring together every congressionally mandated report produced by federal agencies into one publicly accessible portal website. H.R. 4631 will give the public access to the important information contained in congressionally mandated report and will allow them to search for those reports. The bill includes necessary safeguards to allow redaction of sensitive information based on the exemptions outlined in the Freedom of Information Act. The reports will be available to the public free of charge and in a fully usable format. This will allow the report to be searched, sorted, and downloaded in bulk. Congressionally mandated reports should be publicly available in an easily accessible way. These reports often contain valuable information about agency compliance with congressional mandates, information valuable to researchers and citizens. By giving citizens access to these reports, they will be able to judge themselves the quality of agencies' compliance and, in fact, our work. The taxpayers pay for these reports. Shouldn't they be able to read them H.R. 4631 will increase transparency and allow for better accountability and oversight. I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, for a statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, and I thank Representative Mike Quigley for his persistence in pursuing this good government legislation, and also Paul Mitchell for his statement and hard work on this bill. H.R. 4631, the Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act, is a non-controversial, bipartisan bill that should earn the support of everyone on this committee. It has already been approved by this committee by voice vote prior. This is a common-sense measure that would make the government more transparent and accountable. The bill would create a one-stop shop where Congress and members of the public could access reports and request reports and access agency reports to Congress. Federal agencies submit thousands of reports to Congress each year. This bill will improve congressional oversight by making it easy to find and access these reports. What good are these reports if you can't even find them? So this would open them up and make it more accessible. The bill will also give the public access to agency reports. Currently, members of the public often have to file FOIA requests to obtain some agency reports to Congress because many of these reports are not available online. The Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act has been endorsed by almost 40 different bipartisan organizations across the entire political spectrum. I support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. Does any other member wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4631, offered by Mr. Mitchell of Michigan.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is simply a perfecting amendment to make minor changes to H.R. 4631, the Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act. First, the legislation replaces the word website in the bill with the phrase online portal to represent more current technology. The change guarantees that the intent of this legislation endures any advances in technology that may impact how citizens access and view these reports. Second, the amendment rewrites the section of this bill that relates to the Freedom of Information Act. These edits are meant to further clarify that this legislation does not require agencies to disclose information that may jeopardize our national security or otherwise require the government to release sensitive information to the public. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying legislation, and I yield back.
Does any other member wish to be heard? The question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 4631 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 3398, the Real ID Act, modified for Freely Associated States Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3398, to amend the Real ID Act of 2005 to permit freely associated states to meet identification requirements under such act and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this bill up for markup. In 1986 and in 1994, the United States government solidified a unique international relationship by signing the Compacts of Free Association with the Republic of Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. Collectively, these three foreign nations are referred to as the freely associated states. Under the Compact of Free Association, citizens from the freely associated states can enter the U.S. to live, work, and study indefinitely as legal non-immigrants without the need for a visa. However, the REAL ID Act of 2005 made no mention of the freely associated states or the Compact Agreement. Instead, the law referred to, quote, to the trust territory of the Pacific Islands, close quote, a now-defunct entity created after World War II. The former trusteeship predated the current self-governing status of the freely associated states as established under the Compact of Free Association. The unintended omission in the REAL ID Act often requires citizens of the freely associated states, or FAS citizens for short, to settle for temporary driver's licenses that expire after 1 year. Some employers have been reluctant to hire or retain FAS citizens carrying temporary licenses. Many of these citizens have also been denied access to work, housing, transportation, schools, and other opportunities, even though they are lawfully residing in the United States. H.R. 3398 aims to provide a simple technical correction to resolve this issue. It would omit the incorrect term and insert the appropriate reference under, quote, evidence of lawful status, close quote. After proper verification of status, states will be authorized to issue permanent driver's licenses and other forms of ID to FAS citizens living and working in the U.S. Fixing this unintended error in the law honors the terms of our Compact of Free Association and reaffirms our partnership with the 3 FAS nations. I urge my colleagues' support of this bill, and I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ross. The bill before us would make a technical correction to the REAL ID Act of 2005. That act incorrectly identified persons from the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau as citizens of the trust territories of the Pacific Islands, an entity that has not existed since 1994. I support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do so as well. It is bipartisan, nonpartisan, and a needed change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. Does any other member wish to be heard? The question is now on the favorably reporting of H.R. 3398 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The committee will now consider the following postal naming bills en bloc: H.R. 3183, H.R. 4188, H.R. 4406, H.R. 4463, H.R. 4646, and H.R. 4685. I ask unanimous consent that the bills be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, so order. In addition, I ask unanimous consent that the postal naming bill H.R. 4405 be ordered favorably reported as amended by the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. And if there is no further business without objection, the committee stands adjourned.